Imagine a sport where losing meant starvation, or a game that literally trained you for war. That's the reality of medieval recreation. We're about to unearth the incredible, often brutal, physical challenges that were central to community and survival, far beyond anything you've ever learned about the Middle Ages. We usually imagine the medieval athlete as a knight on horseback, jousting in glittering armor beneath the gaze of kings and queens, or perhaps a warrior drenched in blood on a battlefield, his strength tested in life-or-death combat. But the reality is stranger, deeper, and far more mysterious. Medieval physical culture wasn't just about war or tournaments, it was woven into every layer of society, from the humblest peasant village to the cloisters of monastic orders. And when we peel back the layers of history, we find forgotten games, brutal challenges, and strange training rituals that blur the line between survival, spirituality, and sport. Take, for example, the brutal village contests that resemble nothing like modern sports. One such game was mob football, a chaotic struggle played across entire towns. It was less about scoring goals and more about testing endurance, courage, and loyalty to one's community. There were almost no rules. Hundreds of men and sometimes women would chase a ball through fields, rivers, and streets, wrestling and battering one another for hours. The physical strain was extraordinary. Mud-slick grapples, swollen faces, broken bones, and yet, this wasn't just recreation for villagers. Mob football built the toughness and resilience that daily life demanded. A man who could withstand a crushing scrum in February mud could also endure the back-breaking harvest, or defend his family in a raid. Losing wasn't only about pride. It meant humiliation, weakness, and in some symbolic way, an inability to carry your weight in the community. This blurring of play and survival echoes across countless forgotten medieval activities. Consider the stone-lifting traditions of Northern Europe and Iceland, Scotland, and even rural England. Young men were challenged to lift massive carved stones, some weighing hundreds of pounds. These weren't just tests of strength for amusement. In Iceland, a man's ability to lift a specific stone often determined whether he could qualify as a fisherman, whether he was strong enough to row a boat and haul nets in frigid seas. The sport was therefore inseparable from livelihood. Fail, and you might be left without work, without food, without purpose. Success, however, brought admiration, respect, and sometimes even marriage prospects. These stones, some of which still exist and bear the worn marks of countless attempts, stand as silent testaments to a culture that treated athletic prowess as the measure of a man's worth. But there was another layer, one that rarely enters the official histories. Medieval athletics often carried spiritual or mystical undertones. In monastic communities, for instance, physical training was not dismissed as worldly vanity. Certain orders believed that bodily discipline strengthened the spirit. Archery wasn't only a military skill, but also a meditative act, a way of aligning the body and mind with divine order. Wrestling, too, carried symbolic weight. Medieval manuscripts describe monks engaging in grappling contests, their struggle interpreted as a metaphor for wrestling with temptation, sin, or even unseen demonic forces. The body became a battlefield where unseen wars were fought, wars not recorded in chronicles, yet crucial to the medieval sense of existence. And then there were the village contests that mirrored ancient ritual combat. Some historians have pointed to strange parallels between medieval folk games and pre-Christian rites. For example, the violent shin-kicking contest of rural England, where men stuffed their boots with straw and tried to cripple one another. Recall sacrificial rituals meant to channel chaos into order. Did these bruising contests preserve remnants of pagan ceremonies, have remembered and repurposed as games? Or did they represent a collective attempt to train men for the inevitability of violence in their lives? Either way, these activities suggest that medieval sport was not merely for entertainment. It was ritual, it was preparation, it was survival made manifest in physical form. But as we peer deeper, questions emerge. Why were so many of these challenges forgotten or suppressed in official records? Why do our school books tell us endlessly about tournaments and jousts, while scarcely mentioning that entire towns would erupt in violent games resembling riots? Perhaps the answer lies in power. Jousting and tournaments served the nobility. They reinforced hierarchy and showcased elite control. But village contests were raw, untamed expressions of community strength, activities that couldn't easily be controlled or taxed. To rulers and clerics, they may have seemed threatening, anarchic, even heretical. And so, while knights in gleaming armor were immortalized in illuminated manuscripts, the bone-crushing contests of villagers were left to fade into obscurity. Yet archaeological traces remain. In the ruins of castles and monasteries, we find smooth-worn stones used for lifting, strange carved pits that may have been used for wrestling or martial games, and even illustrations and marginalia doodles left by anonymous scribes showing peasants grappling, throwing stones, or swinging clubs in contests that official text never described. These scraps of evidence suggest a hidden world of physical culture, deliberately ignored by chroniclers but vital to medieval identity, even hunting, often remembered as the sport of kings, held dimensions we rarely consider. For nobles, the hunt was both recreation and a simulation of war. The stamina required to track boar or deer across rugged terrain mirrored the demands of battle. But there are whispered accounts, half legend, half history, suggesting that hunting was also tied to forgotten rights of kingship. Some scholars have argued that the boar hunt, in particular, symbolized the conquest of chaos by order, of man's dominion over primal forces. When young squires joined their lords on these dangerous hunts, they weren't just testing courage. They were being initiated into a symbolic war against the wilderness itself, a struggle to prove their right to rule. If true, then medieval hunting wasn't merely about venison on the table. It was a reenactment of cosmic struggle hidden beneath the veneer of sport. And yet, even peasants engaged in their own hunts, chasing rabbits or birds with nets, dogs, and clubs. These activities, though humble, sharpened reflexes, endurance, and cooperation. They were survival disguised as play. They also reveal a fascinating paradox. While nobles used sport to reinforce hierarchy, commoners used it to sustain independence. Sport became a kind of invisible language, shaping bodies and communities in ways that rarely surface in chronicles. When we gather all these fragments, mob football, stone lifting, monk wrestling, shin kicking, ritual hunts, we begin to see medieval sport not as leisure, but as a hidden training system. A system that bound survival, spirituality, and identity into a single force. This was not about trophies or records. It was about life and death, honor and humiliation, order and chaos, and perhaps, buried in these forgotten traditions, lies a deeper truth about the Middle Ages, that the human body itself was seen as both a tool and a symbol, shaped by contests that were at once physical and metaphysical. But the mystery deepens. In scattered manuscripts, we find references to athletic practices that no longer exist or whose meanings are lost to us. A 13th century text mentions games of the circle played by youths in France, involving both endurance and chanting, but offers no explanation of the rules. Another document from Italy describes leaping stones that speak when lifted. Perhaps a poetic description of echoing quarries, or perhaps something more esoteric. Did some medieval athletes believe that certain stones held voices or powers? Could physical trials have doubled as forms of divination or communion with unseen forces? These questions hover at the edge of speculation, but they remind us that medieval minds did not draw the hard lines we do today between sport, ritual, and spirituality. For them, all were woven together. It is in these forgotten fragments that we glimpse an alternate history of the body, one not written by lords and bishops but by the sweat, blood, and endurance of ordinary people. It is a history that hints at survival hidden within play, ritual encoded within recreation, and perhaps even suppressed knowledge about the body's potential. Consider the knight, often imagined as the ultimate medieval athlete, beyond tournaments and combat. Knights underwent years of grueling training that blended physical drills with spiritual discipline. The squire's regimen was almost monastic in its intensity. A boy of noble birth was expected to run long distances in full gear, vault on horses without stirrups, and wrestle opponents until exhaustion. But documents from the 12th and 13th centuries suggest that their training was interwoven with ritualized breathing exercises, dietary rules, and even strange mnemonic chants designed to sharpen focus. Some of these practices seem curiously similar to traditions found in far older cultures, echoes of Roman gladiatorial conditioning, or even parallels with Persian and Indian wrestling traditions. Were medieval knights unknowingly preserving fragments of ancient athletic wisdom, knowledge carried westward along forgotten trade routes? One tantalizing clue lies in the so-called Royal Armoury's manuscript I-33, a 13th century fencing manual considered the oldest surviving European martial arts text. On its surface, it depicts sword and buckler combat, but the manuscript is riddled with cryptic marginal notes and theological references, as if swordplay itself was being mapped onto a spiritual cosmology. Scholars debate whether the manual's illustrations hide esoteric geometries patterns that resemble sacred diagrams found in both Christian and non-Christian mystical traditions. If true, then medieval fencing may not have been mere combat training, but also an encoded discipline of body and spirit, rooted in forgotten philosophies. But knights were not the only ones shaped by hidden systems of training across Europe. Guilds and brotherhoods organized physical contests as rites of passage. In Germany, wrestling guilds fected and held tournaments that drew hundreds of men, where combat was refereed not only for sport but as test of honor. Some accounts describe challengers engaging in elaborate grappling rituals before even touching one another, movements that resembled dance as much as combat. Were these gestures merely ceremonial, or were they fragments of an older physical language, gestures inherited from vanished traditions, half understood but preserved in ritual form? The peasants, too, carried their own secrets. Folk games were sometimes dismissed as drunken brawls, yet chroniclers occasionally hinted at something deeper. A 14th century cleric complained that villagers in Flanders gathered for the old games, contests he described as a wasting of the body and a stirring of the spirit. What did he mean by stirring the spirit? Was he condemning ecstasy, or acknowledging that these games brought participants into altered states of awareness, states useful for bonding communities, or perhaps even for touching realms beyond ordinary perception? This idea is not as far-fetched as it might seem. In many cultures, physical trials served as gateways to mystical experience. Native American vision quest involved fasting, sleeplessness, and exhaustion until visions arrived. In Japanese martial traditions, repetitive strikes or stances became paths to enlightenment. Why should medieval Europe be any different? Could the hours-long endurance of mob football, the bone-grinding contest of wrestling, or the lung-searing sprints of hunting have doubled as altered states practices that tune the body into frequencies of experience we have forgotten? If so, then medieval athletics may have concealed a secret lineage of bodily mysticism. There are more direct traces, as well, in monastic libraries. Alongside hymns and theological treatises, scholars have uncovered strange texts that blur the line between prayer manual and training regimen. One obscure 15th century manuscript from Italy describes a series of physical postures meant to align the humors of the body with the harmony of the spheres. The text prescribes stretches, controlled breathing, and sequences of movement that resemble both calisthenics and ritual dance. Was this merely a curiosity, a monastic experiment? Or did medieval scholars possess knowledge perhaps inherited from ancient Greek gymnasia or even older Eastern practices that saw the body as a gateway to cosmic balance? Then there are the forbidden textbooks that may once have existed, though now only rumored in fragments. Whispers of a lost book of games resurface in marginal notes of manuscripts, where scribes refer to the older sport or the book of contests now missing. Could there once have been a compendium of physical training, part martial manual, part spiritual text deliberately suppressed by church authorities who feared its unorthodox blending of body and spirit? We know that many texts deemed heretical were burned, their knowledge erased. Perhaps some of these lost works contain systems of physical culture that, if rediscovered, might transform how we see both athletics and spirituality today. Artifacts, too, speak faintly of hidden traditions. In rural France, archaeologists discovered stones carved with concentric circles near sites associated with wrestling contests. Were they score markers, boundary stones, or something strange, ritual symbols intended to imbue contests with spiritual meaning? In Scandinavia, runic inscriptions describe contests of swimming under ice-cold rivers, feats that demanded extraordinary endurance. But some inscriptions link these feats to invocations of gods and spirits, as though survival in icy water was not only physical but also spiritual trial. These traces hint at a world where athleticism was inseparable from cosmology, where strength and survival were proof of divine favor. But the suppression of this knowledge seems deliberate. As Europe moved into the late medieval period, official narratives of sport narrowed. The joust, the tournament, and noble hunting were glorified, while the communal games of villagers were condemned as unruly, dangerous, even sinful. The church increasingly viewed physical contests as distractions from prayer, lest they could be reinterpreted as allegories for spiritual struggle. Manuals of combat preserved technical details but often stripped away mystical undertones. It is as if an entire layer of meaning and older philosophy of the body was slowly peeled away, leaving behind only the martial and hierarchical shell. And yet, hints of the older vision survived in whispers. Folk songs preserved references to dances of strength and trials of the circle. Pilgrims carried tales of holy men who endured agonizing feats of endurance, not unlike athletic contests. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts, playful depictions of peasants wrestling, leaping, or throwing stones suggest that the culture of hidden athletics continued, even if it was never granted legitimacy in chronicles. This tension between what was remembered and what was erased invites a troubling question. What have we lost? Could medieval Europe have preserved not only a culture of games, but also an integrated philosophy of body and spirit, one that may have contained echoes of ancient technologies, Consider balance beams used for training knights' agility, or weighted stones shaped for grip strength. These are simple devices, yet their design shows sophistication in understanding biomechanics. What if other devices made of perishable materials or deliberately destroyed once existed? Primitive resistance bands, weighted clubs, or training frames. We know that Indian wrestlers and Persian warriors used such tools centuries earlier. Medieval athletes have inherited similar technologies now lost to time. There are even more speculative whispers that certain monasteries conducted experiments in athletic asceticism, using fasting, chanting, and exhaustion to push the body beyond normal limits. Could these practices have produced states of heightened perception, what today we might call flow states or altered consciousness? If so, medieval sport may have touched realms that modern science is only beginning to study, states where the body and mind merge into extraordinary focus. One tantalizing clue comes from a 14th century account of a knight who, during a contest, fought with such speed and endurance that witnesses claimed he moved beyond the body. Chroniclers dismissed it as exaggeration, but what if it was a memory of a phenomenon we no longer understand, an athlete tapping into reserves of strength through practices now forgotten? Slowly, the picture comes into focus. Medieval athletics were not just physical contests, but fragments of an older system, one part survival, one part ritual, and one part suppressed philosophy of the body. A system erased by the needs of power, hierarchy, and official narrative, yet still visible in the margins of history, waiting for us to notice. And this raises the deepest question of all. What if the human body itself was seen as a kind of technology, a living mechanism capable of extraordinary feats if properly trained? Medieval athletes may not have used machines or laboratories, but through games, rituals, and contests, they explored the boundaries of endurance, strength, and perception. Perhaps their forgotten training contained insights we have yet to rediscover. If the first layers of this story revealed the raw contest of survival and the suppressed rituals of body and spirit, then what remains is the deepest layer of all, the possibility that medieval athletics were not simply games but fragments of a forgotten science. Not science in the modern sense of equations and laboratories, but a holistic technology of the body where movement, strength, and endurance were woven together with philosophy, cosmology, and even the whisper of ancient civilizations long gone. That we have to remember that the Middle Ages were not sealed off from older worlds. Europe stood on the ruins of Rome, and Rome had borrowed from Greece, Persia, Egypt, and beyond. Knowledge moved along forgotten trade routes, merchants, pilgrims, mercenaries carrying not just goods but stories, techniques, and secrets. When we examine medieval training through this lens, the fragments take on new meaning. The stone lifting of peasants echoes the weighted clubs of Persian warriors. The lung-bursting endurance of medieval hunts mirrors the ritual chases of Celtic druids. Even the grappling contest of monks resemble Greco-Roman wrestling, filtered through centuries of adaptation. Could it be that medieval Europe, far from inventing these games anew, was preserving a lineage of physical culture stretching back into the ancient world? But if this is true, why do we not hear of it in official chronicles? Perhaps because the knowledge was never meant for everyone. Power in the Middle Ages was not merely political or economic. It was also about controlling narratives, deciding which traditions were remembered and which were forgotten. The joust, with its pageantry and hierarchy, reinforced noble dominance. But communal games that strengthened villages, or rituals that blurred the line between body and spirit, were far harder to contain. Suppressing them may have been a way of fragmenting communities, ensuring that the most powerful physical traditions did not challenge the established order. And yet, we find clues where they should not exist. In 15th century Spain, a marginal note in a theological treatise refers to Los Jugos de los Antiguos, the games of the ancients, described as trials where men tested strength in sacred circles drawn on the earth. No explanation is given, no details survive, only the phrase, what were these ancient games? Were they survivals of pre-Christian rituals still practiced in secret corners of Europe? Or echoes of an even older science of the body, one stretching back beyond the Middle Ages, perhaps even beyond Rome? Consider also the geometric patterns hidden in fencing manuals and illuminated margins. Some scholars dismiss them as decorative flourishes, but others notice uncanny correspondences with sacred geometry. The same ratio is found in Gothic cathedrals and ancient temples, even in the pyramids of Egypt. What were these diagrams doing? In manuals of combat, were they simply aesthetic? Or were they encoding something more in an attempt to link movement of the human body to the hidden mathematics of the cosmos? If so, then medieval athletes may have been more than warriors or villagers. They may have been participants in a forgotten dialogue between flesh and number. muscle and geometry, body and universe, there is another layer still darker, in the accounts of witch trials and heresy prosecutions. Accusations sometimes mention strange gatherings where men and women danced, wrestled, or endured pain together. Authorities called them orgies of sin, blasphemous games, or diabolical trials. But what if some of these were distorted memories of ancient athletic rituals rites where the body was pushed to extremes as a form of knowledge? If so, then the suppression of medieval games was not simply moral panic. It was a systematic erasure of alternative ways of training body and spirit, ways that threaten the monopoly of church and crown. One haunting clue emerges in the story of the Compagnia della Calza, a Venetian fraternity of the late Middle Ages. Officially, they organized pageants and spectacles, but scattered reports describe them engaging in secret endurance contests, long swims across the lagoon at night, prolonged fasting combined with strenuous feats, even ritualized combat in abandoned courtyards. Why? Were these young men simply thrill seekers? Or had they inherited fragments of older traditions hidden in athletic orders that used the body as an instrument of transcendence? If so, Venice may have been one of the last places where such practices survived openly, disguised as spectacle until they, too, were erased. The body, then, was more than muscle and bone. To the medieval imagination, it was a vessel of mystery. Endurance meant more than surviving exhaustion. It meant touching the boundary between life and death. Strength was not just for lifting or striking, it was proof of alignment with unseen forces, and games, whether brutal or joyful, were rehearsals for realities that transcended ordinary life. Perhaps this is why so many of these traditions feel strangely resonant even today. When a modern athlete pushes through exhaustion, when a runner describes entering a trance-like state, when a weightlifter speaks of feeling connected to something beyond themselves, they echo experiences our medieval ancestors might have understood more deeply than we imagine. They knew that sport was not just play, it was a portal, and yet, the most unsettling possibility remains. What if these athletic traditions were not only symbolic or mystical, but practical echoes of technologies we can scarcely imagine? Think of the way breath control, posture, and endurance alter consciousness. Think of the way rhythm and repetition reshape the brain. Medieval athletics have preserved not only forgotten rituals, but also fragments of an ancient science, of human potential, what we might even call a proto-neuroscience of the body. If so, then we have lost more than games. We have lost a way of exploring what it means to be human. And in their absence, history feels thinner. The chronicles speak endlessly of kings, wars, and saints, but the raw vitality of peasants wrestling in mud, monks grappling in cloisters, and knights practicing secret breathing chants, these are barely remembered, yet they mattered. They mattered because they remind us that the Middle Ages were not a world of ignorance and passivity, but of bodies in motion, testing themselves against hunger, danger, and mystery. They mattered because they suggest that medieval people may have known truths about endurance, focus, and transformation that we have forgotten in our mechanized, digital age. Imagine, for a moment, if those lost manuals were discovered. Imagine a manuscript revealing how games of endurance doubled as meditative states, how wrestling rituals encoded cosmological truths, how stone lifting was connected to geometry and sacred sound. Imagine what it would mean to rediscover not just the physical training of the Middle Ages, but the philosophy hidden within it. Perhaps it would change how we understand sport. Perhaps it would change how we understand ourselves. For in the end, the story of medieval athletes is not just about contest in mud or the clash of swords. It is about the mystery of the body itself, a mystery that civilizations across time have tried to unlock, often in ways that blur the lines between sport, survival, and spirituality. The Middle Ages were no different, and though much has been suppressed or forgotten, the fragments that remain hint at something extraordinary. That play and struggle, exhaustion and triumph, were never trivial. They were keys to survival, keys to meaning, and perhaps keys to secrets still buried beneath official history. So the next time you picture the Middle Ages, do not see only castles and battles. Picture the villagers wrestling in fields until they collapsed with laughter and pain. Picture the monks chanting as they grappled in cloisters, every throw a metaphor for temptation. Picture the knights lifting stones and reciting chants, their bodies instruments of war and prayer. These images, half hidden, half erased, remind us that history is not only what survives in chronicles, it is also what survives in the human body and traditions of movement, play, and endurance that echo across centuries. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest secret buried in medieval athletics is that we, too, still carry fragments of this forgotten knowledge every time we push our limits, every time we test ourselves in sport or struggle. We touch the same mystery, a mystery that once bound survival, community, and spirit into one. A mystery that refuses to be forgotten. That is the story of how medieval athletes trained beyond swords and jousts. Beyond tournaments and hunts, a story of survival, ritual, and suppressed knowledge, hidden in plain sight. If this journey into the forgotten has sparked something in you, stay with us, like, share, and subscribe, for there are more layers of history still waiting to be uncovered.